Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another Daily Maverick webinar, which is exploring different aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic and the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's day 48 of the lockdown. There were yesterday 11,350 confirmed cases in our country and 206 deaths. We have nearly 4.1 million people worldwide now confirmed with COVID-19 and nearly 300,000 deaths. So we are in the midst of a very serious pandemic. I think we all know now, as listeners and viewers, how COVID-19 impacts on our individual health. But what we're also seeing is how COVID-19 impacts and exposes a nation's health. Just as COVID-19 takes advantage of what we call comorbidities or pre-existing illnesses in a person, it takes advantage of pre-existing conditions in a country, and particularly its inequalities. So today we're here to talk about one of those areas of inequality, which is vital to our response, and that is the question of water and access to water. We are very fortunate and thankful that Amnesty International has sponsored this webinar. It's linked to Amnesty's campaign called Turn on the Tap and the Right to Water. And to have a discussion about water and COVID-19, we're also very fortunate that we are joined by two experts to help us through this discussion. The first, I see him in my middle, I'm not quite sure where you'll see him, is Xhanti Payi. He's an economist. He's written about water in the context of COVID-19, and he's a consultant in a company called Nascence Advisory. And the second is somebody you may have heard of on the radio, an environmental scientist, Simon Geer. He's been with us for a long time. We've heard his voice on and off our radio stations. And so both are going to help us to explore this issue. So I want to start the discussion with the fairly obvious and then move into the slightly more complex, but I do want to build the argument. So, Xhanti, you first of all, why is water so important in the context of COVID-19? Why has it become an issue that lots of people are talking about?
Well, I think you put it very well when you frame it actually that the situation we're in is important because it has exposed the inequalities and the deficiencies in our society in a very stark way. I think those of us who knew, people will say, if we thought we were in a bad situation economically and socially before COVID-19, it has actually exposed those really, really, really sometimes dramatic, if not sad, inequalities that we face. And water has been part of that because access to water, I always make this joke when I say in my house, I live alone, but I have access to multiple taps and just for one person. And you'll find that there are communities who will share taps in long distances. And this has been an important thing because I think if we think about even just, food creation, drinking water, going to the bathroom, washing our hands and all of that, and that this virus is actually defined by washing of your hands, being in contact with people. So whereas I won't see a lot of people, but I can go to the bathroom without seeing anyone and drink water, people who don't have water have to go outside and brave social distancing to get their water. They've got to wash their hands. They have to share toilets, and that emerging research now shows that through use of bathrooms, you can actually spread it. So it really tells us that all of the things that we knew we had a problem with are actually being stuck to because it's, what we would have said, in Africa, we like to share. Sharing has become the very thing that, and most people depend on shared water, and not only shared water as a national resource, but actually as an individual resource. And I think that is why this reveals such a big a problem for South Africa.
So water is vital to health, and if there's no water, then it has a negative impact on health, but particularly at a time when you need water as critical to our prevention measures around COVID-19. Simon, would you like to add anything to what Xhanti just said?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's not just in the water sphere, but just generally, this really has been a wake-up call for middle-class South Africa as to just how big the gaps are in our society. I mean, I think we all knew it intellectually, but to suddenly see the difficulty in creating quite simple rules that can be followed by everyone in South Africa, and the pushback that we've seen from middle class South Africa around silly things like Woolies chickens are a result of this difficulty of how do you make a rule that is applicable to an informal settlement that is just as applicable to the suburbs. And I have a lot of sympathy for the decision makers in trying to tiptoe down that balance, because it would not be appropriate in South Africa to have different rules for different geographical areas because of our history. And as Xhanti has said with the water issue, it is such a fundamental human right. It's something that is a massive embarrassment to South Africa that there are still households where 50 or 100 people are sharing one tap. I mean, or don't have flush toilets. That is a massive embarrassment. And I think that more than anything else, COVID is acting as a wake-up call politically, and is probably going to result in quite a strong push back to trying to force some equality into our society.
Well, you've two key words there, Simon. First of all, as you said, you talked about water as a fundamental human right. In our country, it's a fundamental human right that is reflected in our constitution. In fact, the constitution says everyone has a right to sufficient food and water. It says everyone. It doesn't say citizens. It says everyone has a right to sufficient food and water. And both of you have raised this question of inequality, and I want to explore that further a little bit later. But given what you've said, does it make a mockery of the public health advice? I mean, if a large part of our population can't wash their hands for 20 seconds 4 or 5 times a day, what do we do? If for a large part of our population, the simple act of washing your hands means standing in a queue and therefore placing yourself in harm's way of the virus, is it better to stand in a queue to wash your hands, or is it better not to wash your hands and avoid possible contact with the virus? How do we weigh up these socioeconomic factors that work against public health advice with what we know is still the most effective non-therapeutic way of preventing COVID-19 infection? Xhanti, let your thoughts first.
I think what has been true. I mean, if we just watch the response of the government, in the Department of Water, distributing all those tanks and making sure we're putting out water, and then having wash areas. Even in that context, people have still to travel. So even though you brought in some of the water, people still have to travel to get to those water taps. And then usually people also bring water to their homes, so for their perhaps day's supply. And that has made it interesting because I guess if you have a household of 5 people living together, and every time they're in contact, they have to constantly wash their hands. That makes it very difficult to have it as a regime that is in any way sustainable. So I guess at the same time, then we must stay at home. But that staying home is also a problem for many people, and for I think it really does highlight here that interventions. I think one of the things that we learn here, especially from an economic perspective, is that we have not while the things we expected, so the programs that we've had for economic inclusion, for people to work, have all been inadequate. We have not really adequately prepared for the world in which that would come. And I think we can see it because we think about housing now, and we think about how people live, and that those livelihoods have been, I guess we've missed the point, because we could for a while say, look, we can have shared resources. We want to bring people closer together. They must work closer. Our community to be much more dense, and because they must be closer to economic resources. And then it may be the very thing that actually endangers them. So I think the main thing that it tells us is how we actually have to reimagine how water is provided, the types of water that is actually provided. Because I guess also what is important is to see water as it has different uses. So it's never really, and I think the reason that someone can, I guess, speak to this, we need water to do different things, right? People in agriculture, in cleaning, in ablution facilities, in drinking and cooking water, and all of these things. And we've always just, been, we can provide water as one source. But I think had we thought differently about water for its different forms, we may be in a better position at the moment to be able to actually overcome the kind of shortages and what people do. So, and it might look very, very different, because then, the cost of water differs depending on what you think that water is of use and where you deliver it. So I think it's that we really could have done things differently had we actually expanded our thinking around the provision of water as other actual human rights.
Exactly. So you talk about, we now have to reimagine how we use water. One of the people on the chat line talked about using water as the provision of water as a foundation for a Marshall Plan, or part of a foundation for a Marshall Plan of reconstructing South Africa. I'm going to come to these questions of the economics of water and the inequalities of water in a minute. But Simon, let's shift the discussion a little bit, unless you have anything you want to add to Xhanti, and just say, is there enough? I mean, we all hear that South Africa is a water scarce country compared to many other countries in the world. Is there enough water? Is the shortages natural, or is it linked to man-made? I say man-made because it often is man-made. Is it to do with the inequalities that we have created and that we have tolerated? Can you give us a bit of a scientific perspective on this?
Sure. I mean, I would start by saying, while South Africa is a relatively dry country, absolutely the shortages we have are man-made and often political rather than scientific. Yes, when you do have severe droughts, it does exacerbate existing problems, as we saw with the Western Cape last year. And was it only last year? It feels like a lifetime ago that we had the countdown to zero in Cape Town. And the Eastern Cape, of course, have had massive drought-related problems with their water. But that said, I would say probably the vast majority of water shortages in the country, and I would include not being able to drink the water out of your tap as a water shortage as well. Just because there's stuff coming out of your tap doesn't mean that's usable in a healthy way. I would say that allowing our water infrastructure to degrade has been one of the great failings of the last 25 years, and it's been a real pity that we haven't been able to maintain that. Because not only does that mean small municipalities in particular are no longer able to provide potable water to their citizens, but also raw sewage is being pumped back into our water system, and that then affects the sort of lower grade water that is used for agriculture and that sort of thing. So certainly I would say the vast majority of water shortages in South Africa are economic or political, not climate related.
And that itself creates further inequality. So as you say, man-made, we've allowed our infrastructure to degrade. We'll come back to that in a minute. It's a governance question. It's an equality and a governance question. But we think in the context of this discussion, we're thinking of water for washing, we're thinking of water for drinking, we're thinking of water for flushing toilets and for sanitation. Who uses the water of South Africa? If there's enough, Where's it all going? Why is it that in some rural community, Makanda, there's no water to drink, or in other rural communities, and yet big mines or big farms have an unlimited supply of water? What's going wrong? How do we regulate? How do we control in the interests of health and equality? Should somebody be being punished? I mean, somebody has said on the chat line, why aren't we prosecuting in the context of COVID-19 companies that are abusing, that are basically stealing common water resources and using it for profit rather than in the interests of communities who desperately need it at this moment for life? Xhanti, you're an economist. Let's.
I think we've been relatively poor at planning and sharing resources. I mean, there's a big now about water rights and providing water rights and what it has been. And I guess it's been linear. I need water for food, and people say it's food security, so a farm deserves it because they make more food. Or we know that the commercial interests are important because they will create jobs. So that it's always a one-liner rather than how could we structure, because we, communities and companies and farms, they all live together. And so it is not as if you can answer one of the questions. We can answer all of them with a plan that actually works. So we often you will, if every time you license, I think this is, we've seen in the mining sector, for example, where they say, if you are a mine and you are going to start there, we want you to also respond to the challenges in the community that you are in. I think for a long time, especially where there's so-called private dams or water resources that are kept by some people without willing to share, government in its governance and regulation has been quite weak in making sure that actually water resources are shared and are protected for everyone's benefit. So it's not really useful to say that 7% of our water, for example, goes to commercial or agriculture. It should say, and therefore this has been the problem, because we should not have gotten to a situation like that goes without actually being used. We should say what percentage of what type of water goes into agriculture, so that we actually know that we are fixing the problem. So we are still far away to actually resolving the economic problem of inequality and the different powers that can struggle. And I think that the government has not actually been really willing, and I think we can go sector by sector in terms of how we actually expand and share resources in South Africa. We have a major problem of shared resources, and we should actually attend to that quickly, so that when we come back to a situation like this, because clearly crisis, every time we face a crisis, we say, oh, next time we face a crisis. I mean, it's the same thing with a drought, in which we can have a situation in which, we had a drought, and these droughts, and someone will agree, they come periodically, right? So we kind of can expect them. And that because we know they are coming, we should have been prepared so that we didn't have the devastation that we had in terms of people's livelihoods. So it is about planning and preparation, so that we don't keep asking ourselves the same question over and over about how did we get to this situation when we could have planned, in terms of the irrigation systems, the storage of water, how you treat it, all of those things that we know, in terms of planting, crops that can withstand droughts and all of these things. These are things that, it's not as if now we are sort of animals in the field and basically the elements come to us. We should be a pretty sophisticated society. So I think the main thing is that for how do you plan and how do you bring everybody to the table to make sure that when we face not just a crisis, but how people live. I mean, there's all sorts of talk, and I think we'll get to this way. For example, I know that, and somebody was asking in the chat there about what happened to the Bill Gates funded or supported initiative for waterless toilets, for example, and a lot of people are talking about that. That is something we should have been talking. That should have been part of our structure already, so that we then don't have to worry about certain things. So I think it is all about the science innovation that exists, the way we plan, the way we bring people together, and not to pretend that every time we are surprised that we came to the end that we find.
Yeah, I think that I agree with Xhanti to an extent, that we're a sophisticated society now who shouldn't be just passive receivers of the natural world. But I was fascinated watching the situation develop in Cape Town, because what happened there was we've seen an increase in the middle class population of Cape Town and development of things like golfing estates over the last 20 years. at a rate far faster than anywhere else in the country. With that, the Western Cape is the one area that we really can see a climate change signal in our water availability, where we're seeing measurably warmer summers, measurably more variable winters, and I think the Western Cape was always vulnerable, and we probably are seeing the beginnings of a climate change signal in that seasonal variability. And I thought significantly in the lead up to that season that they had the water crisis, the Weather Service forecast a normal season from a rainfall point of view. And these guys are good. Our Weather Service is world class with that sort of thing. And about 2/3 of the way through, they admitted, they sent out a press release saying we got it wrong. We can't trust our own models any longer. And so I think particularly with the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape, we are more and more going to become, I would say, almost passive receivers of environmental change when it comes to water.
So you're talking, Simon, about a crisis, overlapping series of crises, and I've heard this before. We have COVID-19 now, and COVID-19 is probably going to be with us for years to come. Optimistically, at least another 2 years. But you're factoring in the climate crisis, which you're suggesting is having an impact on water availability. And in a sense, although we're not talking a great deal about the climate crisis at the moment, water is an area in which the two crises are manifesting at the same time and impacting on our public health response. And the climate crisis is only going to get worse. Am I right?
We think so, yeah. And it's been so interesting for me. You know, I've been worked in climate now for 20 years. And when I first started as a climatologist, we were always saying scientists are predicting this is what is going to happen. And now in the last 5 years, I've seen a distinct change to this is happening now. And certainly Anthony Turton was raising the flag about Cape Town at conferences I was attending 10 years ago, saying Cape Town is going to be the first major crisis, and he was completely right. The problem with Cape Town as well is that it's not like we can go and really build bigger dams or more dams. That area is dammed. There's not too much more that we can do from that point of view, and it's so about managing what we have. There are some high-tech opportunities, things like accessing the aquifer that comes off Table Mountain and desalination and those sort of things. But that becomes a more sort of complex discussion around, you know, do you want electricity or do you want water? But certainly I think some sort of fundamental changes to the way that water is accessed in Cape Town is probably going to become a normal. Well, it has become a normal already. You know, they're never going to go back to the profligate use of water that used to happen. The rest of the country, I think, probably is not going to be as fundamentally climate constrained as the Western Cape is. There, the constraints are far more and easier to fix as well. You know,
and the Eastern Cape, would you add?
Yeah. Eastern Cape definitely is fundamentally climate constrained. Yeah.
I mean, we all looked at Cape Town's day zero, but in parts of the Eastern Cape, and there's a report by the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign that lists water-stressed communities throughout South Africa. I think they list 49 communities, but I'm sure that there are more. You know, there are communities in rural parts of the Eastern Cape that haven't had water for 3 years. Hard to believe, but that is the case. So what you're describing is a scenario that is only going to get worse and makes the question of how we use water, how we distribute water, not an academic question that we can ponder for a few decades, but a question that we should have begun to answer quite a number of years, and we're being caught wrong-footed by the COVID-19 epidemic. Xhanti, I want to say something.
So I think this is an interesting thing, especially when we discuss climate change, because South Africa has been at the forefront of these discussions, right? I mean, people descend on Durban to discuss climate change. So we always knew that the environment is changing. We certainly have been participating and signing all the agreements towards actually managing climate change. And you would think that because of that, we would have been at the same time then participating in, for example, in our budgeting systems for the effects of climate change, because it's one thing for the government to be a signatory to some big global climate change agreement, and then not make the plans to actually make sure that you incorporate with that. So every year we put money into infrastructure and we put money into all sorts of investments because we are planning for things to come. And we say, and we have the Vision 2020 and all of the Vision 2030. And there we say, towards the National Development Plan, we are putting this money, but also we should be saying towards climate change, which we think is going to be a big thing for us, and it will actually affect people's lives. I mean, we have also known, there will be fights for water and all of these things. So why we should have been actually putting money into that sort of infrastructure. And I think the thing that we're raising in that article was really the idea that we know that we are not going to have we don't have infinite resources. So what do we do for the kind of resources that we've got, the fiscal, financially? And I mean, one of the things that we're going to see now will be probably cuts to budgets, because we are in this fiscal situation that we're in, being downgraded. There isn't enough, but we've always known these challenges, and so we have to sequence our planning in such a way that none of these things are apart. So if we really think part of our water shortages are because of the problem we face, so we can't, and I think the mistake will be to say this is a COVID-19 crisis, because actually it is a much broader project and a much broader thing. So that actually we would not be here if we had been actually planning. I mean, I think people had always been talking about the crisis that we face in the future and shortages. So this just shows us that the thing that had been expected to happen is happening. So we could have been called something different. So it's not really useful that this has been brought about by COVID. It could have been anything. And so we still have to be prepared for other crises. So, and this is the moment, I think, to use to talk about that. I mean, we talk about, for example, municipalities and their capacity to provide water, to clean water, to and the work that they have to do. And we have all those problems there. But they also relate, those problems just don't relate just to water. They relate to other things as well. And so again, the point is that we need to have a much more comprehensive discussion about the issues of inequality, of access, of infrastructure, because they all come together. And I think the climate change question is particularly important, I guess, because it seems the one thing that we are signatory to all sorts of treaties about it. So we might as well use that as one way in.
We're going to come back to that in a minute. As I listen to you, I'm hearing two things. I'm hearing a kind of that you both agree, looking backwards, that we've allowed inequality to develop. We haven't used our water resources properly, that this was a crisis waiting to come. And as I see you looking forward, I see you both talking about better management, about the impact of climate change. And then, Xhanti, you say this is not a COVID-19 crisis, which is right. But COVID-19 is exacerbating this crisis now. Now, if I'm watching you two talk at this moment, and I'm living in a informal settlement, or I'm living in a rural area, or my kid goes to a school that doesn't have sanitation and doesn't have water, or I can't flush a toilet, or I can't wash my hands, I don't want to just hear you talking about these big infrastructural things that have to be done at some point in the future, and we know how bad government is at doing that. I also want to know, what should we be doing now? What should we be doing next month? What must we be doing the month after next month to respond to this emergency, in part by providing people with the water that they need? So can we turn for a few minutes to some practical suggestions that you think could address that short-term need? Simon, to you first.
Well, I thought it was fascinating. One of the very, very first things that the national government did in response to COVID-19 was to buy up every single water tanker in the country. I thought that was an incredibly powerful statement of intent. So straight away, that shows that at national level, in that emergency planning or crisis committee or whatever they call themselves, water was something people were thinking about and were worried about. So it clearly is part of the agenda that is being discussed. I'm seeing a lot of people suggesting rainfall tanks in the comment list, and I would agree with that. If we've been able to put solar geysers onto every RDP house in the country, why can we not do the same with some sort of rainfall capture? It does sort of create the problem that you only get that rainfall when there's rainfall available anyway. So it's a sort of feast or famine kind of an issue there. But that's certainly got to help. Whether we could roll something like that out in the timescale necessary for COVID response, I don't think so. But it's certainly something that we probably need to look at in the future. But in terms of the immediate emergency aspect, I think the fact that they've already bought out all of the tankers is a really, really good sign. And if there was something we needed to nationalize, I think probably that type of infrastructure is it, so that we take away the issue of them being stolen and being redirected. Because if they all belong to the government, well, then anyone anyone that's in private hands raises suspicion.
So one practical thing: water tanks in all houses, in all communities, to catch rainwater. Okay, that's one suggestion. Xhanti,
I think in that context, again, so that this, when I say this is not a COVID-19, because it could have been any other crisis, right? Because some crisis was always going to happen, and therefore this one seems to have caught us first. And we have had this response of water tanks. Now, one says, well, after this, if we were to find a cure for COVID-19 and we move on with our lives, does that mean therefore we didn't need these things? But they do, and we always needed water. And so how do we make sure that these become part of our planning going forward? And I think one of the things about the water master plan, talks about actually investing in these various types of water provision, so that you can actually.
Let me interrupt you. You in your article, you talked about it costing, I think, 109 billion rand to fix water infrastructure. And of course, we're in a very fiscally constrained, disastrous situation. So there's no 109 billion rand, and yet we have this emergency need. So what do we do? Because we can't postpone this. How do you, as an economist, square the needs of people to have their rights to water fulfilled with an economy that doesn't recognize or want to fulfill those rights?
So think about it like this. So the water tanks themselves, right, are not going to fill themselves outside of the rain time. So we need to find ways in which we use different kinds of water, right? Reservoirs, groundwater, some sort of creativeness. And then we should be very serious about investing properly now. Because I think in terms of crisis, it gives you at least that kick. And then we can take this opportunity, because we've already had that kick, to then invest in other source of infrastructure. But it's also because one of the things that is important is that, especially in areas that are rural, is that because most of people didn't have a lot of water, they could not actually also provide their own food. So that when they found themselves in crisis, we could not have been able to, continue to plant, and so they still have to go. But, there are communities where if you allow them sufficient water, they would actually be also providing their own food. And so this crisis is more than just the water for the drinking and washing of hands, but also water to provide your own food, which also takes us then to issues of land and land ownership and all of that. So all of these are connected. And I think the point is, how then do we say, because of the interventions we have already undertaken, which are quite expensive, how do we then make sure that they become structural, as it were? So this becomes the way we go forward. Actually, this is the structure in which we build water provision. Now people have tanks. There are hardly any areas where there isn't tanks, and then there is water provision, then fixing that infrastructure. And then you plan around what we've already spent. Because I think one of the things sometimes we do is, where if we think about, for example, when we're building stadiums, and then many of them are not being used because we didn't structure them in such a way that they become part of our infrastructure and our lives, so that we can use them for multiple things. And I think with the water tank, there is grand opportunity to then continue that investment path. So with the limited resources, we've already spent the money. how do we make sure that, and how do we include communities, for example, to participate in that? And then thinking about innovation, for example, is another thing about sanitation and saving water, because clearly part of it is that it is also in this moment that we have to manage our water resources better. So it's one thing to say we're going to build tanks, but how will that also help people manage those tanks? Because when they start leaking, that is going to be so all of those things we have to think about it now, because the thing that always catches us off is also the quick wins, and we like to do short-term things. But in the short-term planning, we should also have in mind some long-term goals to make sure that while we are putting short-term interventions, they become part of our long-term goals. And I think that is a grand opportunity now, because obviously we are providing, as Simon says, we have provided all those water tanks all over the country. Now they become part of our infrastructure. While we will continue to do other things, but here's an opportunity to actually build into it. So I think it's a much more practical thing, because then we can spend the money, we can say we've always wanted to do this, and then of course bring in other partners. But I think the main thing is to resist the temptation of, well, we are in a crisis, let's do the short-term things. Let's use this crisis to actually build on the longer-term structural issues.
I agree with you, but I agree with you, but I'm still, as I listen to you, what I'm understanding more strongly than at the start of this conversation is that we can't hope to control COVID-19 without solving the water issue.
Yes.
But water is fundamental to solving this. So there needs to be a COVID-19 plan, has to have a water plan. But what I see is ad hoc measures. Yes, it's good to send out JoJo's 41,000. I think only 11,000 got delivered or something. But it's not enough. There should be a sustained mobilization around water provision, taking into account everything that you are saying. So my question is, I know you want to speak, Simon, but what are the systems for water governance? How do we try to pool the intelligence that we have in this country about ways of saving water, ways of collecting water, ways of reducing water pollution, ways of ensuring water cleanliness, ways of ensuring water equality and no inequality? What governance systems? Because unless people become involved in this, people like you, I don't know to what extent you're consulted by the Minister of Human Settlements, for example, but unless people become involved in oversight, then I can bet you my bottom last rand that nothing is going to change. We'll have this conversation again in a couple of years' time, and we'll just be looking at a more difficult situation. How do we tap this wisdom that you are both referring to, Simon?
Well, firstly, I don't trust municipal level governors to look after our water. They've proven themselves in the last 25 years to be unreliable, and we've seen a deterioration in small town water quality to the point where just about every small municipality now in the country you can't drink the water. It's only the places that are served by huge organizations like Rand Water. It's horrendous. Yeah, absolutely horrendous. And part of that has been a brain drain from municipalities, and part of it has been poor financial management. And unfortunately, the long-term or medium-term solution to this is very, very boring. It's getting proper accountants into local municipalities and strongly directing top-down water policy from national level. I just don't see how it can be done any other way. This is a problem that's going to be solved by accountants, not by engineers.
Simon, just a quick question, because I saw it on the chat line, and Xhanti, if you can think of it. Are there examples of good water governance in parts of the country? Are there best practices that you can cite that meet our tick boxes of equality, cleanliness, conservation, etc.? Can you point to anything?
Well, I think the obvious one, it seems to be the more centralized, the better. So Rand Water, I think, is a world-class organization. It's not without its problems, and they still lose an enormous amount of potable water through aging infrastructure. But you can still turn on any tap in Johannesburg and drink the water out of it completely safely. And I think that allowing or expecting small municipalities to run that infrastructure themselves is just unrealistic. And then adding to that poor governance, it just becomes an impossible situation. So my gut feel is that it has to be we have to move in a centralizing direction rather than in a decentralizing direction for water management.
Xhanti, is that your gut feel?
I agree. I think that definitely our governance frameworks and our institutional framework needs to actually work much better than it does. And I think it has been a problem in the sense that while it is true, of course, we have a democratic structure that says, such power belongs to municipalities, such to provinces and all of that, but that we may need to actually rethink that and actually find better frameworks and give where there is capacity. And I think one of the big problems sometimes that we faced is the hope that we can build some, we can build, the capacity in those areas. So someone is quite right. So, let's go and help municipalities with that capacity. And every time, and it seems never really to work. And so we have to be quite serious actually about perhaps, our frameworks for governance have to be rechecked and rethought so that they can actually be fit for purpose. And I like the idea where he uses these water boards. Some of them are not as good as others, clearly. But I think what we learn from that top-down approach in terms of providing dams is how quickly you can do something that important, and actually you can roll it out successfully and almost have. And I think actually there's probably even a cost-effective angle to that, because if you're the sole buyer of tanks, clearly there only will be one price. So you won't buy one for 100 Rand and then one for 150 and another one for 350. And so you can roll it out. You could actually even participate in the manufacturing of them, because in some way you are the sole buyer. And I think this is an important lesson to say. Our frameworks have to be changed so that they can deliver exactly this. And if you have a master plan, and people keep asking about it, the master plan is important because it actually then allows you to think and implement something instead of each person or each area implementing something that seems to be unique to them. Of course, you can tweak it, I guess, because it's quite obvious that while you may be able to do water desalination in the Western Cape, in the Eastern Cape, not so much in Limpopo and Gauteng. So those kinds of things. So I think the main point is to actually make sure that our plan is sound and that we have the frameworks to feel it, whether it's in governance or it's in the different institutions. And that's going to be a very, very big thing. That's also important because actually, as we think about going forward about water, right, and investing in water, we're going to need institutions that are fit to actually be able, to raise funding, to think about costing water. They want to what's the price of water and different kinds of water, of course, and that managing also the water in terms of who uses it more than who. And I think those are kind of things that we have to now think about in a framework. So part of our plan has to be, how do we actually manage it, and the institutions that will do that work. But I know you are an activist, so you want people to participate. And sometimes I think we may not have be practical to say, all groups of people must be part of the solution, because they can't always be part of the solution. And that's, I think, what we've tried to do with the municipal system, in which, because municipalities are closer to people, they are better able to reach those needs. We are finding that that's not true.
But from what I see, and I wish I knew more about water. Pardon me for a second. From what I see, it is actually very often community-driven initiatives that make the difference. I see it's people who are trying to clean up the Henops River in Gauteng, who are jogging the municipality. I see that it's people who are inventing new water reticulation devices. I think one's called the Tippy tank, for communities where there are shortages of water. I see it's people who are raising the alarm about areas where there are water shortages. For example, in the Eastern Cape, it took people from Graafrenet to point to the empty dam in Graafrenet and to the municipal corruption in that area. So again, for me, and what I worry because we are privileged people. Each of us is sitting in, as you said at the outset, Xhanti, houses where we have half a dozen or a dozen taps in our homes, is that if you leave the power with people like us, when the crisis is over, we're comfortable and we forget that there was ever a crisis. But the underlying inequalities that we're now having to look at are still there and haven't changed. And that's why I'm asking you both to give me something more radical, not radical for the sake of radical, but I can believe in it, that this is going to bring real change. I mean, I see at the moment, I see these tanks being sent out to communities. I see a government effort. I don't see a private sector effort. I see swimming pools still being filled up and golf courses still being watered. We can do things like that, but we can't get waters into nearby communities. So if we're serious about the change that we want, don't we have to be a little bit more concrete? Simon, you're chomping at the bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to chat about there, but I think we've done this very, very well with electricity over the last sort of 10, 15 years, with concerns around climate change and people wanting to be green this and green that and everything else. So now, you know, that you cannot build a new complex without everything being solar powered in terms of at least water heating. And I think we need to go to exactly the same place with water, that it's very, very difficult to retrofit a house to be able to use grey water. It's, you know, you're requiring knocking out holes in your walls and new pipes and all of those sort of things. But it's very easy to create a system when you're building for the first time to direct your kitchen sink water into your toilet system. It's not a difficult thing to do. But it's so those sort of basic systems where we start getting people talking about grey water, understanding that the effect of watering your lawn and that sort of thing, and getting sensitized. So that's a really, yeah, it doesn't have a massive impact on the overall water availability, but it absolutely does affect raising the consciousness of water in the society. The obvious thing is to raise the price of water. I mean, that's how you create value. But that's I don't think is something that would work very, very well in a society like South Africa. But I definitely think, you know, outright banning the watering of lawns, for example, you know, regardless of how much water is available, is important, because that would force people to plant the types of gardens that don't need watering. And I think it's that type of thing that will sensitize people to the changes that are necessary.
Thanks, Xhanti.
I think that, and you know, speaking to the more practical things, I think you were asking earlier about, and I want to agree with someone here about how much the Minister of Human Settlements consults me, I would say, fairly regularly. And I think one of the things that we have to think about is, and someone's quite correct about how we start to build, again, to make those connections. I guess we have that opportunity now to make those connections between how we build, you know, how our houses are constructed. I mean, when we did this with electricity, providing solar panels that also have some geyser capacity, that was good, and we didn't think about it. But I think people, when we talk about practical solutions, we don't really think about innovation, because it seems to be pie in the sky. But innovation is going to be quite important when we talk about this, you know, waterless toilet systems, or, you know, more efficient toilet systems. That's critical to actually implement as part of our mainstreaming our water resource management. We can't sort of, even though people say, you know, this is not a thing yet, those are the things that we have to do. Innovative ways of capturing water, of storing water. I mean, I think there are some systems in which actually people take water from the air, from the atmosphere, and, you know, all of those things. Those are systems that we can build. How we manage those things now, and all of those things that have since now been, you know, innovative or pie in the sky, very big, are the things that we absolutely have to do, because otherwise we're going to be here. But as Simon says, we have to plan properly so that from the moment we build a house, that house is able to do all of those things already, and that's important, so that it is a change in our mindset going forward. I think it's grey water use, all the different kinds of water, how we think about it, and it's something we've been talking about for a long time, which is a framework on how water is priced is important, and it can do all of the different things that we wanted to do, because we know, for example, with electricity, we have that basic supply of water before you actually start pricing for poor people. So we can tend to all the different needs in terms of what water is, and in terms of what society is how it's structured. So for the poor, for business, for agriculture, all of those things can be done in a plan if we decided we were going to be serious about making sure that we want to meet all because we are a diverse society with different needs, and water has different uses, and therefore we should plan accordingly. It is no longer useful to think about it as just a one single commodity, because it isn't. And so in that sense, I think it's quite important. And then, of course, the uses are in the private sector. Those users who waste are punished, or they can clean their own water. Everybody can do different things. We should be able to be sophisticated enough to want to do that. And I think it will be important, because the less resources you've got, the more forced you are into that point. We should not wait until suddenly we've completely run out of water, or we are now in a worse crisis than we're in now.
So, but a few of you have said, both of you have said, well, maybe we should put the price of water up. But isn't that part of the problem? I mean, isn't putting up the price of water going to increase the inequality in access to water? Who do you want to put the price of water up for?
Well, I mean, I think the Cape Town model during the crisis of having whatever it was, I can't remember the exact numbers. Was it 50 megalitres or something like that? Was free, or very, very low price, and thereafter it ramps up very, very quickly. So if you're filling swimming baths or watering a lawn, you must absolutely pay through the nose for that. And I as a climatologist, I have almost no faith in humanity's willingness and ability to change for the sake of change. All the really good, big, sustainable changes that we've made as a species have been forced on us economically or practically, and I think water is absolutely no different. And so we should really, the way to get people to put water tanks on your factory roof, for example, is to either make the supply of water unreliable, which is what has forced the solar panel industry, or to make it very, very expensive.
I agree with that. And I think already we have a system, right, where it's indigent. So the free basic services already exist. So we have that framework where poor people can actually get free basic water and free basic electricity. And that takes care of, actually burdening poor people with high prices of water. But then at the same time, all people should be responsible for the management of this resource, and pricing is probably one way in which we can do that, right? Because in one sense, we can't just sort of say you get 2,000 liters and then you shut it off, but we have to find some ways that work. And I do think that it's almost it makes very little sense not to play to what people respond to the most, which is exactly that. I mean, an unfair example, for example, it might be about how we think about, airtime. Most of us use airtime, and we manage it very well because we know what it really costs. So if we may be able to use that, those kinds of frameworks, we've done it with electricity. The more the price of electricity went, the better we all managed it. I think this is going to be very, very important going forward. And that we should not be shy to actually really price for the cost of water. People, and also just to make people understand, I think that a lot of people think, but water is free, why should we pay for it? And we know that actually, yes, water is free, but it is the delivery of that water that's not free. And so therefore people, have to pay for the delivery of water, cleaning it and putting it in a pipe and arriving at your house. That's very expensive exercise, and so we should manage it. And much of our discussions haven't had that. So you can have, for example, communities leaking taps. But I also wanted to say there's something interesting about what you were saying, Mark, in terms of where there are all these initiatives. I think another important thing in our planning should be how we mainstream community initiatives or activism into the way in which we work, because I think part of it is so that where systems are failing, we can mainstream initiatives that family communities come up with, so that actually then that becomes part of our system. And that thing has been difficult in the sense that people are trying to push things into municipalities that never work because we don't have a framework in which people care. Say where they are actually finding solutions to problems, that those solutions become part of the structure. They're mainstreamed, obviously, within the right kind of legal frameworks, but that is something that we're going to have to think about.
Can I very, very quickly, because we are about we are about to run out of time, but something that we touched on right at the beginning is this problem of getting people to wash hands, but you've got a limited amount of water. Something that would be low-hanging fruit is to really drive a communication program where we differentiate between water that you use for washing your hands and water that you use for drinking. Because we're going to get into a situation, at the moment, the problem is how do you isolate people from just having to go and queue for a tap? But we're going to get into a situation where we're going to have to isolate inside our homes, granny from those people who are economically active. And that's where having water to wash your hands, not necessarily water to drink, is going to be so important. And to get people sensitized to that split. You can get water from the river because you're going to be using it to wash your hands properly before you serve Gran her food. Those are the types of messages we need to get out there.
Do you think there's enough water literacy? You know, in my days in the Treatment Action Campaign, fundamental to building a response to HIV was community-based education about this virus, about the medicines, about how you got HIV. Do you think there's water literacy? I mean, you've just raised an important point, Simon. Do you think many people are thinking, I can use grey water to wash my hands, if that's what you're saying, and tap water for another purpose? You know, is there this level of understanding, this level of actually thinking about the water that comes out of the tap or doesn't come out of the tap and how we use it?
I've got two kids who are sort of in early teens. I've never seen that message come through any of the sort of media that they consume.
So we need it.
Absolutely have to do it.
Sorry, say that again?
No, I'm saying we absolutely have to educate people about water and the different uses of water and how to manage water. I absolutely think that is one of.
Oh, Xhanti's gone.
Okay, well, we just lost Xhanti. Don't go yet, Simon. I just want to round this up.
Sure, no problem. I do see Biola is saying that there are a couple of good pamphlets out there, but they never get circulated, which is probably true.
Okay. Listen, the basis for this discussion was about water as a right. I think you said that at the outset, Simon. There's a right to sufficient water in our Constitution. Our Constitution is our supreme law. That right has to mean something. And that was the basis on which Amnesty International set up this webinar to explore the meaning of the right to water, the duties that flow from the right to water in the emergency context of COVID-19. I think this discussion has gone in many, many directions, but I hope that it's been helpful at least in flagging for people the intersecting issues of the climate crisis, of how we use our natural resources, the connection between water and health and water, and the fact, and this is where I'll finish and say thank you to Simon and Xhanti, that COVID-19 is not going to be over in a month's time or 2 months' time. We have to be thinking about this as a virus that is going to reshape our society over years. And so when we talk about water, we have to be thinking of this not as something that we need to do as a quick fix, but as something that we need to do as part of a permanent change in the way that we live with the resources that the earth provides us with. So Simon, thank you so much for what you do as an environmental scientist. Thank you to all those who've joined us. It's very hard for me to keep up with everything that's going on the chat, but I see lots of interesting ideas and proposals and issues that we haven't been able to explore properly. And I do hope that people will find a way to keep this conversation going, to work with the community activists as well as the experts, because this issue is an issue that we have to get to the bottom of. So thank you all, and thank you to Amnesty International, and thank you to the Daily Maverick for making this possible. Go out and save lives. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Cheers. Stay well. Bye.